a certain kind of love, I'd say.
This is Karsan Turner for KJHK's Ad Astra broadcast, back with the first episode of Season 2 of my show, B-Sides, the podcast where we do a deep dive on an artist's discography and their life surrounding their work. And as always, I'll send you all home with a playlist made by yours truly. Kicking off Season 2 is a very special artist who started out as the bassist for vulgar, free folk avant-garde group Jackie O Motherfucker before producing her solo work and releasing what I consider to be the best album of 2019. Today, we're going to be talking about Natalie Merring of Weyes Blood. And fun fact, it is pronounced Weyes Blood. It's taken from the Flannery O'Connor novel. The reason it's spelt the way it is because there was a Swan side project that already had the same name.
But Weyes Blood, this is a Swan's side project, and it's all one word. But I think it was Greg from that band Espers came up to me when I was a teenager, and he's like, you got to be really careful. Those guys from the 80s need money, and they're going to sue you for being called Weyes Blood. And I didn't know at the time that maybe that wasn't going to happen, so I changed the spelling of my name, and the rest is history.
Don't worry, Natalie. I know what it's like to have your name spelt differently. Anyways, you know the drill. We're going to start off with Natalie Merring's first release and then work our way up from there. Weyes Blood released her debut album The Outside Room on May 10th, 2011. An overall experimental and creepy album, opening with the track Storms That Breed, a haunting song with chilling circus organs throughout, along with Natalie's glooming church choir voice, makes the album's opener sound like you're visiting an old part of your childhood that's barely intact. The Outside Room is by far Weyes Blood's most experimental album. I wasn't able to find any reviews on this album to kind of gather what the consensus was at the time of release. I'm assuming because it wasn't super popular. That being said, a lot of ratings today are pretty high. Merring credits this experimental phase of her music to her love for horror movies growing up.
Well, I think for me, definitely with horror films, those are some of the only places in music or in the mainstream where like interestingly spooky experimental music kind of leaks into people's ears. So when I first started making music and I was a little on the weirder side, my family and people would be like, oh, it sounds like a horror film. So I kind of took that as a compliment and got into a lot of horror film soundtracks.
The Outside Room isn't really an album for everyone, but it's a great listen if you're wanting something that's more out there. On October 21st, 2014, Weyes Blood released her second album, The Innocents. Described as gothic folk electronica, The Innocents is much more spiritual than her previous work. The Innocents is reminiscent of Panda Bear's 2011 album Tomboy, also using a church-like structure to the songs and with heavy use of reverb, drones, and vocoders. Nina Corcoran of Consequence of Sound describes The Innocents as somber, deadpan singing with a sense of detachment peering into the chasm of an emotional collapse. All right, we get it. Someone has an English degree. It's a very gloomy and melancholic album that should only be listened to if you're trying to be sad. But I sincerely mean that in the best way possible.
Pretty bad magic, pretty tragic, on the runaway train, and I'm not going insane.
The Innocence is where Natalie's vocals really start to develop and the arrangements of her songs become much more focused. I can see this being an album that during the recording process of this podcast, I say something like, "This is a good album." But then after I release the podcast, I start to think and I go, wow, this album is incredible and I really, really like it. This literally happens on every episode of B-Sides. And actually, that'd probably make a good side episode. Anyways, we're going to move on. A year later, on October 8th, 2015, Weyes Blood released the Cardamom Times EP. I've listened to it a few times, and I honestly don't have a whole lot to say about it, other than it's a good preview to her 2016 project, Front Row Seat to Earth, which is where her discography really starts to pick up.
I stand apart from the rest. I had so much to give.
Little over a year later, on October 21st, 2016, Weyes Blood released Front Row Seat to Earth. While The Outside Room and The Innocents gained cult followings and were met with good reception, Front Row Seat to Earth pushed Mering into the limelight so everyone could enjoy her ambient folk pop music. The album cover depicts Mering lying in front of a dried-out, man-made lake, which she describes as an environmental disaster zone.
That was taken at the Salton Sea, which is an abandoned kind of resort lake town in the desert of California. It was a man-made lake that evaporated slowly over time and over-salinated, like became too salty, and there was like a mass extinction of fish and wildlife. So it's kind of like an environmental disaster zone, and then the resorts were all abandoned, and so it's like really blown out and abandoned, and it's like a very strange geological phenomenon because there's so many dead things. I think there's like maybe one type of fish that can still survive in the water.
Front Row Seat to Earth is a critique of the modern world and the technological consequences we've faced because of it.
Kind of assimilating to new forms of technology that are supposed to bring us closer together but actually make us kind of grow further apart. And it's also about, personal experiences of mine, being somebody that's a seeker and kind of continuously searching for different experiences and kind of wandering around and absorbing a lot of energy from a lot of different places.
Instead of outright rejecting modernity, Mering wages that we should be aware of its consequences while navigating through it.
Is about cell phones and how they kind of... They're tapping into an instinctual human desire to stay connected, which is a very natural human instinct.
A good example of this is on the track Generation Y, where the spine of the song comprises modern waving synths and vocoders before going into a traditional Celtic piece, as if Natalie's trying to tell us that we can use modern technology to revive the great aspects of the past. The track Do You Need My Love discusses the plethora of dating options and the false sense of connection brought about by social media apps, with the sharp piano kicking off the 7-minute piece.
Tired of feeling so had the world that I knew just fell through and left me outside.
Arguably the best track on the album, Do You Need My Love builds up to a climactic spiritual chorus with harmonies reflecting hymns from the Renaissance era. Again, combining multiple music styles to tell the listeners that the modern world has killed love and it needs to be reborn. Row Seat to Earth was well received among critics. Pitchfork awarded the album Best New Music with a score of 8.3, calling it sly, assured, and self-aware. KJHK's McConnell Wilson wrote in his review of the album that upon release he found it to be a great listen while you're studying for exams, and it's a great album for anyone looking to explore modern styles of folk music. From 2016 to 2019, Mering collaborated with a few artists. She appeared on Drug Dealer's 2016 debut, The End of Comedy, on 2 tracks. Track 3, Suddenly, starts off with a somber piano melody before breaking out into a 70s disco beat in the chorus. Track 8, named after the album, The End of Comedy, is a minimal jazz song about Natalie's love for laughter.
I'm in love with laughter.
Mering also appeared in Drug Dealer's 2019 album Raw Honey on the track Honey, a relaxing late 60s sunshine pop song that sets Mering's voice to a band instead of just a piano.
I know that you want to be seen and to be heard, or to be loved, it's not a crime. Money is the root of the game, what you stand to gain, but everybody's gonna lose.
Both of Drug Dealer's albums are great in their own right. However, Natalie's tracks are the best pieces from the band. Her work with Drug Dealer is much more different than her solo work. It's less complicated, and the songs draw from late 60s and early 70s pop. Usually these are just components of Mering's more complex solo work. Overall, her collaboration with Drug Dealer is a great change of pace, especially hearing her voice in a simpler setting. Moving on to 2017's Myths 2 EP, which I didn't include in my Ariel Pink episode of B-Sides because I could spend more time on it in this podcast. Myths 2 is a collaborative EP that Mering did with Ariel Pink, and it's really good. Released January 27th, 2017, the 4 tracks draw heavily from medieval folk, something I never thought I'd hear Ariel perform. The opening track, Tears of Fire, starts off with an acoustic Celtic melody led by Ariel with a sudden falsetto clash from Natalie.
Not a liar, it's really all my fault. I choked up with desire. Say again. Rest in pieces rot, roasting pigs on the pyre.
The second track, Daddy, Please Give a Little Time to Me, is much shorter and written like a poem.
Daddy, please give a little time to me.
My favorite track on the EP is the closer, On Another Day, a softer duet between the artists, making a satisfying conclusion to their wonderful collaborative project. All right, now we're going to get into the great stuff. The reason I decided to make this episode in the first place. On April 5th, 2019, Weyes released her 4th studio album, Titanic Rising. Take everything that made Mering's previous work great and throw it all together, and you'll get the best album of 2019. Titanic Rising has much more complicated arrangements, and it's more orchestral, but it's much more accessible.
If I could go back to a time before now, before I ever fell down.
Mering acknowledges this different direction with the album's opener, A Lot's Gonna Change.
A lot's going to change, actually. The first song. That was the first thing that I wrote, and I knew that it was kind of like a new level for me in terms of kind of hearkening back to some of my favorite older composers and songwriters, like Gershwin or Hoagie Carmichael or something. I was like finally figuring out how to play those chords painstakingly on the piano. And I spent a lot of time laboring kind of in that zone and trying to figure out how to write a true classic song.
The pace is slightly faster with an emphasis on percussion and strings. The album's poppiest track, Every Day, further comments on the themes of Front Row Seat to Earth's observation of today's lack of love.
Wake up, baby, it's getting late now. Feels so hard like I always do. I'm so scared of being alone, it's true, it's true. I see you every day.
Yeah, the whole concept of that song is the idea of needing love every day, kind of, even if it's ADD, even if it doesn't last. But we're really not like our parents' generation in that sense. Everybody is kind of on their own path and spoiled for choice, and a lot of people are unwilling to forfeit their independence for a monogamous relationship, so it kind of really changes the whole scene.
Mehring further explains this new culture is the reason true love needs to return.
The idea that that would be something that would need to have a comeback, True love is making a comeback because we're all getting so tired of Tinder and everything that we want some true love to come back and be more exciting than, this polyamorous, not true love or something. So
the upbeat 60s love track gradually builds up with electric organs before hitting the Beach Boys-esque chorus. Titanic Rising's sixth track, Movies, is Natalie's best song, hands down. Starting off with an underwater sequencer, scratchy strings, and Natalie's delicate vocals to carry the first half of the track.
Put me in a movie, and everyone will know me. You'll be the star, you know you are.
From there, the piece gradually builds up with echoing harmonies that start to fill this wall of sound. Halted by scratching violins, ending with earthquaking drums to bring the climactic song to its end. Movies is a wild ride, and its clear beginning, middle, and end really makes you feel like you are in a movie. Natalie credits the album's success to having more creative freedom to experiment with the instruments in a studio as opposed to her traditional home recording setup.
Going into writing this album, I felt so lucky and so grateful that I'd finally been afforded the opportunity to work with a lot of people I wanted to work with and have a lot of time in one studio to kind of create a very generative kind of volcanic musical environment where we were bringing a lot of people in to play, string players, working with reel-to-reel tape machines and just experimenting and spending whole days on soundscapes and just kind of being, afforded the resources to do something like that. It was completely new.
Titanic Rising was a critical success upon release and sits in various top 20 best albums of 2019 lists. The internet's busiest music nerd, Anthony Fantano, gave Titanic Rising a 9 out of 10.
The color palette on this album is great. Sounds very rich, sounds very glamorous. I think Weyes Blood combines all of these older pop elements together in a way that feels very modern, very solid, very beautiful. Feeling a strong 8 to a light 9 on this thing.
And on Metacritic, a username going by KJHKJHK said, "This is definitely my favorite pop album I've heard since 2017's Melodrama," and then also says, "Movies is probably the last song I'll listen to before I die." Aside from critical success, Natalie has also gained commercial success with Titanic Rising. Natalie's going to appear in a future episode of NPR Tiny Desk Concert and was featured on Late Night with Seth Meyers.
Performing every day off her critically acclaimed album Titanic Rising. Please welcome to the show Weyes Blood, everybody.
Speaking of live performances, I decided for this episode of B-Sides to do something special. Luckily, Weyes Blood performed at the Bottleneck last week, and I was lucky enough to see the best tracks from Titanic Rising live. I tried to get an interview with Natalie, however, Titanic Rising's success filled up her schedule way too much and I was unable to make that happen. Still, real quick, I want to give a shout out to Michelle from Sub Pop for being very accommodating and trying her best to set up the interview in the first place. So, I was left to my own devices. I ended up bringing my audio recorder and captured my interaction with Weyes Blood while she asked about the hauntings of Kansas.
So, you guys got any local haunts? Like abandoned mental institutions?
Stole, Kansas. It's like a small town.
It's a small town that's completely abandoned.
It's got one of the 7 gates of hell.
7 gates of hell!
In the cemetery.
We're gonna go party there later.
Stole, Kansas. Yeah, nice voice, buddy. Gosh, that soundbite is so bad. I don't even know why I included it, but, I had to do what I had to do. After the incredible performance, Natalie came out afterwards, and I asked her a quick question about Lawrence, Kansas. Okay, so I just wanted to know what your impressions are of Kansas, because it's your first show here, right?
Yeah, my impression is good. It's a beautiful town. There's a lot of hip kids. But I can't help to think about the creator of Wizard of Oz being like a huge proponent of the genocide of the Native Americans, and that's pretty sad because I was a big Wizard of the Oz fan or whatever. Wizard of Oz, sorry, not Wizard of the Oz. And I'm a big fan of Kansas, and I was so sad to recently discover that fact. Of course, that has nothing to do with you, so...
Thank you. Well, I'm sure glad that Natalie doesn't personally hold the current residents of Lawrence accountable for the persecution of the Native Americans. For more details on the show, there's a review I wrote up on the website. All I'll say here is the Bottleneck was a great venue for Weyes Blood to perform. Its smaller size made the interaction between Natalie and the crowd prevalent throughout the entire show, and it was very organic. So there you go. I hope you all enjoyed the Season 2 premiere of B-Sides. As always, there's both a Spotify and Apple Music playlist in the description of this podcast if you're interested in checking out the outstanding music of Weyes Blood. But as always, this has been Karsan Turner for KJHK's Ad Astra broadcast.